Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. How you guys doing? Good. My name is Dahadi Lewis. I am a pastor in Atlanta, Georgia. I wish I did not put it on the slide, but I wish I had a picture of my family. Yes, I am married with 6 children. So we call ourselves the Lewis 8, and so my wife and I got married 11 days after 9/11. So we've been married for about 24 years. And so now we got busy quickly. And so we have basically a 22-year-old, a 21, a 19, 2 18-year-olds, a 16-year-old. So basically, I'm asking you to pray for me. That is ultimately what I'm asking for. We have, 3 girls and then 3 boys. We have 4 currently in college. So if my oldest daughter decides to go to grad school, which she is leaning towards that, what will end up happening is that we will have 6 kids in college at the same exact time. And so, yes, Lord have mercy. So we're going to have an offering in the back later as well But again, I'm excited. Not only excited to be around other disciple makers and church planners and church pastors and leaders that are committed to fulfilling the Great Commission. Right, it just makes me excited. But I'm also excited to be here in Texas because, for me, as someone who wasn't raised in the church, I came to know the Lord in 1996 as a 20-year-old college student. And immediately the Lord took me out of California and moved me I got a scholarship to the University of North Texas. And so again, and it was at that time, I never forget the day, January 10th of 1996, I met a guy named Art Hooker, and Art Hooker introduced me to the very first Christian community that I ever knew or imagined or hoped. That Christian community would tell stories and just in normal conversations of stories like David and Goliath and Samson and Delilah. And I was like, who are these people? Because I wasn't raised in the church. My dad played pro football, and everything that I did and didn't do was because of sports. I wanted to be a pro athlete like my dad. And that was my North Star. Football was my God. And when I didn't get a scholarship out of high school to a major Division I school, I only had a couple of smaller schools offer me. And at that time, if you didn't go major D1, you knew you wasn't going pro. That's when I started looking. I was like, there has to be more than life than sports. And that's when I began to search. I began to ask the Lord, like, Lord, what do you, not ask the Lord. I began to search. I started studying Hinduism, Buddhism, African tribal religion. I became a world religions major really out of this quest of something that was deep inside of me, desiring for something more. And it was at the time, my best friend at the time, his mom bought me a Bible. And basically, that was my introduction to Christianity. Now, when I say that, ultimately, I would have said I was a Christian before because I thought it was like multiple choice, right? I'm not Hindu, I'm not Buddhist, but I don't remember in high school, I don't remember in my, ever having a Christian conversation. So I was never anti-Christian, but no one ever shared the gospel with me. And oftentimes I'm passionate about doing urban ministry. I'm passionate about doing ministry, this ministry here and raising up missionaries because somehow I was able to navigate 19 years of my life never having a conversation about God. And I know we talk about we're oversaturated in America and all those things, but it just wasn't a thing. It wasn't an issue. And whenever we think about being missionaries or disciple making or bringing the gospel to every man, woman, and child, oftentimes that type of vision is not what you guys are talking about. It's for when we go overseas, when we go send people other places. All the while, I believe God, we are raising up a Bible-less. There's so many different things that people like me, and I think my story is no longer the anomaly. It's no longer the anomaly. The only thing that they hear about the church is what we're against. Because here it is. When I first came, I came to know the Lord, and as I was really wanting to understand, I'm hearing the stories about David and Goliath and Samson and Delilah, and I was like, man, I need to catch up. Right? And so I was like, I don't know. And so I was like, Christians know their Bible. So I need to know my Bible like other Christians know their Bible. And so I would start going to InterVarsity, Navigators, Campus Crusade for Christ. I was at a different Bible study. I went to a couple of cults, by the way. But it was just I didn't know the difference. I just wanted to grow. Because in my mind, I was in spiritual tour days. Right? I didn't know what it meant to be a Christian, but I knew sports. I knew football. And that's what I did. So like every single day I was going to a different study. And that's really what had happened. And so when I was going to these studies, like in Navigators and Crusade and all that, I started hearing words that my newfound friends, new believing friends, weren't talking about. And these friends were words like evangelism, discipleship. And I was like, I know my friends love the Lord, but they're not talking about these things, right? Because to them, Christianity was don't go to the club, don't drink, don't have sex outside of marriage, don't join a fraternity or sorority, don't. And I was just looking, I'm really clear on what we're not supposed to do. I just don't know what we're supposed to do, right? And that was really the tension. And so as someone, I started hearing these words, and so I started inviting my friends, and I was like, hey, there's this new thing, there's these new terms that we're not talking about. And it's evangelism and discipleship. It's like, yeah, we know about that. I was just like, well, then if we know about it, why isn't anybody doing it? And that's really where like the Lord struck my heart, and I had a passion and I had a desire, right, to do what I'm doing. And so ultimately what I did, like any young believer, I just started inviting my friends to these studies. And they would come into these studies, and it would always be something like, man, I love the teaching and everything, but I'm not feeling the acoustic guitar. We're a little bit more celebratory in our worship. And ultimately they were saying like, I can't make that cultural jump with you, Dahadi. I'm with you, but I can't. And so it was at that time the Lord grabbed me, and and I was just like, Lord, like, I just want to create a space where I can invite my friends to, and I was just like, Lord, I want to be the last generation forced to leave the urban context for sound discipleship. I wanted to bring the gospel to where they lived, where they worked, and where they worshiped. And that was our heart. And I wanted to be, and what God was placing in me, and I couldn't put words on it at the time, but he was raising up a missionary, because I felt like this third culture kid. It was like either I was around a group of people who understood my context, but they didn't have the same commitment to theology and mission, or I was around a group of people who understood theology and mission in the way that I understood it, but they didn't understand my context. And I felt like this third culture kid. And so what we just did, we just tried to create a space that could be both culturally relevant, doctrinally sound, but missionally engaged. We wanted to be about discipleship. We wanted to be about disciple making. And so I oftentimes tell people, I said, my call to the ministry wasn't a call so that I can preach. It was a call to make disciples. And it was in my formation that the Lord started off with parachurch ministry, and understanding that discipleship was this a one-on-one, a one-on-two, or one-on-one, one-on-3, one-on-12 mindset. Then I started seeing, I was like, but there was a problem, because Jesus says, upon this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell would not prevail. And so I had a tension in me. And again, I'm still in discovery. I know you guys had to figure it out, but I'm still learning these things. And I was just like, there's a tension, because none of the models of discipleship that I'm seeing is being embedded in the context of a local church. And it was sort of like even pastors and leaders is like, okay, I do church over here, but then I make disciples over here. And I was just like, and there was no connection. I was like, how does God's primary vehicle fit into this idea of God's Great Commission? And that's really been my journey. My journey has been about how do we as believers make disciple making not a ministry of the church, but the ministry of the church. How can what we do be about discipleship and disciple making? And that's really what I want to talk about today. So a group of us, basically, we started a church in Denton, Texas in 2004. And that was also when there's a Christian hip hop guy, Lecrae and Tadashi and all them, they all came to know the Lord in 98. And then so they started getting national attention and things like that. And people were just like, man, you got something that's both relevant and sound and all that. Where do you get that from? And people were starting to move to Denton, Texas. And if you've been to Denton, Texas, it's not your urban hood, right? It's just like, so it wasn't like the space that we were like, okay, this is probably not the launching pad that we have. And so we started wrestling with, Lord, where would you call us to be? And so, in December 15th of 2007, basically my wife and I made a commitment to leave Denton, Texas and move to Atlanta, Georgia to start a church called Blueprint Church. And when we made that commitment, 25 others basically says, if you guys go to Atlanta, we're going with you. And that number eventually became 40. So 40 people moved from Texas to Atlanta to start Blueprint Church. And people was like, well, how did you do that? How did you get so many people? And when did you start Blueprint? And I say, most people think that we started Blueprint Church on January 3rd of 2010, because that's when we had our first service. But Blueprint Church wasn't started then. Blueprint Church was started in 2001 when the first group of people moved into our home and were discipled by us. And so what ended up taking place was that 35 out of the 40 people that eventually moved with us at some point in time lived in our home. And we was discipled by us, because at the core of what I believe discipleship is based upon Matthew chapter 4:19. When Jesus, we talk about the mechanics of discipleship, discipleship is an invitation into relationship and is a challenge to change. In Matthew chapter, that leads to ultimately the transformation. So it's invitation, challenge that leads to transformation, right? It just in a generic sense of what the mechanics are. And so in that, ultimately what Jesus says is, follow me and you will become fishers of men. So in there, follow me, invitation, you will become, challenge, fishers of men, destination, aim. And I think that that's important. If we're going to make disciple making not a ministry of the church, but the ministry of the church, we have to be really clear on where we're going, where we're taking them. And so today, really in this first time, I know we're breaking this up into 3 different sections. For the first 2 sections, what I want to do is just kind of give, and it'll be a little bit more. I know they told me to rush to the nuts and bolts, because I don't have to convince you guys about discipleship and why disciple making. So we're going to rush to some of the nuts and bolts of my journey and how we have tried to make disciple making not a ministry of the church, but the ministry of the church. But I do want to give a little background and little things that I think is important, because I don't want you just to come in to, and I don't assume that you will, but I don't want you to come and just say, all right, here's what Blueprint does, here's what we can do. Because what I find oftentimes is that we hear and we do things like that, and what ends up happening is we end up becoming David wearing Saul's armor. Okay. Right? And so it's not like the armor that I have on, what we do at Blueprint is because of years of just preparation and trusting in the Lord to doing for such a time as this. And so in here, again, and so I wrote a book called Among Wolves. But before that, let me just say this. So today, the goal is threefold. Number 1 is, I want to know, do you know your vision from burden? Do you know your vision? Do you have clarity on what you're trying to do? Number 2, I want to ask the question, can you communicate that vision from burden? And then the third one is, can you turn it into reality? So, do you know we all have the burden? Discipleship, disciple making. Don't have to do a lot of convincing in this room. But the question is, can you communicate it? Does your congregation know where you are taking them? If Jesus says, follow me, and you will become fishers of men. So, was Jesus successful? Usually you're going to say yes, especially in Christian circles, just say yeah. Like whatever you say, yeah. Yes, right, he was. But when we get to the book of Matthew chapter 28, he says, go and make fishers of men. Go, he uses another word, go and make disciples of all nations. So at the very outset of his call, Jesus says, follow me and you will become fishers of men. There was clear. And so part of this is that I want you to understand that there was clarity at where Jesus was taking them, but he was not comprehensive. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing, because so many of us feel like we got to be comprehensive every time we talk about Jesus that we lose clarity. Yeah. Right? Jesus, not Dottie, Jesus said, there's so much more I want to teach you, but you can't handle it all right now. But when the Spirit comes, he will lead you into all truth. And so sometimes in our desire to be comprehensive, we lose the clarity, and that people don't know where you're actually taking them. Where are you going? Right? And so Jesus, in his first call, he says, follow me and you will become fishers of men. Really clear on where he was taking them. And so it's really important that we understand that that dynamic. And so as we begin to talk about it, again, when we talk about, so you're not David wearing Paul's armors, I want us to kind of recognize whenever we are shaping this, there's a few things that we need to be thinking about, right? That impacts your practice. And I like to excavate things so that we can know, because the more we understand what influences what we do, the better we can understand and, become architects of what we do so that you can do something that fits and tailors you, right? And so there's these three things that we talk about and, that I teach our staff and our congregation oftentimes. And it's principle, prudence, and preference. Principle, prudence, and preference that impacts your practice, right? What do I mean by that? Principle means there is a biblical address there. This is something that we find in the scriptures. So if I would just use the example, do not fornicate. I can give you a verse in scripture that says, do not fornicate, right? That's biblical principle that we have. I can find it in the Bible. I can see it's not open for interpretation. I mean, this is like it's clear. Prudence is wisdom that we can get over the years that we have seen, whether through church history, through just living life or what, but we can't find it in the scriptures. Do not cohabitate, right? There's nowhere in the Bible that says do not cohabitate. We'd have to use verses like don't let your good be spoken evil of, and like different things like that. But wisdom will tell us don't cohabitate, because if you cohabitate, you're probably going to end up fornicating, right? So it's just wisdom tells us that. Preference is don't date. I've kissed dating goodbye, right? And so that's just preference. That's his personal choice. That's you like CCM, I like gospel. You like I like, preference. The problem with our day right now is that we become really light on our biblical principles and we have become heavy on our preferences. And that's the hills we end up dying on, is our preferences, right? And so, but you got to understand that your principles, prudence, and preferences impacts what you do, your practice. So we just have to be really clear that as we begin to build this out, that we understand these dynamics, right? Because if we're going to say that discipleship isn't just a ministry of the church, disciple making is the ministry of the church, we have to begin to think about how are our practices being fleshed out within our congregation, and are we clear on our practices? Because what I want to help us to begin to do, we're not going to be able to do it all today. I do a cohort, and I have a thing but we're not going to be able to do it. But this is a piece of it. I want us to help build a playbook, or even the thing, because it's important that we create a playbook. Not that just but that your staff, your team, your core team, your congregation knows and understands. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so this is the goal of what we're trying to do. And so at our church, basically one of the things that we talk about is, at the very core, and I'm going to show some nuts and bolts, but if I get in front of it, let's just say a new membership orientation class, one of the first things that I'll say is I want you guys to know that a call to membership is a call to discipleship. A call to membership is a call to discipleship. So if you say you want to be a member at this church, you are saying that you want to be discipled by this church. And there's implications to that. And we'll talk a little bit more, right? A call to membership is a call to discipleship. And so, and the way we want to do it, to build this playbook, is by three things. Four things. We want to create clarity, movement, alignment, and focus. How do we establish those things so that we are all clear? Another way of saying it, if we go to the next slide, basically we're building this roadmap. And this roadmap that we're doing is this, like, we're talking about clarity, movement, alignment, and focus. That's supposed to be a T. It's messed up. It's something, I just want y'all to know I can spell. Just looking, but so clarity, movement, alignment, and focus. And so just think about it. Think about it this way, right? When we think about clarity, movement, alignment, clarity is you have to create and establish clear wins. Jesus says, follow me and you will become fishers of men. clarity on where you are going, where we are trying to take you, right? And then the movement is what are the easy, obvious, and strategic next steps in order to accomplish that goal, right? Alignment is how do we align our ministries and our practices in order to create the movement that we need so that we can accomplish that goal. And focus, saying no to good things so that we can say yes to better things. Clarity, movement, alignment, focus, because we're going to make disciple making not a ministry, but the ministry. We have to have it. So think about it like this. Football. How's UT doing right now? Can we talk about football? Are we okay with that? You know. All right, is a safe space to talk about? Okay, good. So, because, I know sometimes the emotions go up and down. You don't talk about certain things. All right, but we're talking about football right now. All right, so when we talk about football, the goal of football is what? Winning. Right? The goal of football is winning. And here's the thing. When you think about winning, right, the way you win is by scoring more touchdowns and field goals than the other team. Right? So I think to get more touchdowns and more field goals than the other team in order to win the game. Right? That's clarity. And at the end of the game, until the Dallas Cowboys just tied, at the end of the game, you know whether you won or you lost. I didn't understand the whole tie thing. I didn't even know that was a rule that changed. All right, I'm getting off track. But the goal is just simply, hey, score more touchdowns and field goals in order to win the game. So that's the aim. So when you go, you create aims. Now, what does movement look like? We know that there's no plays that's designed to try to score a touchdown every single play. Matter of fact, if you try to score a touchdown every single play, you're probably going to end up losing. Right? But the idea of it is that in order to get more touchdowns, I got to get more first downs. And the more first downs that I get in a row, the more touchdowns and field goals I will have. But we even know that there's not, a lot of times you can't just try to get 10-yard plays every single play. So the goal is that I got 3 downs in order to get 10 yards. So ultimately, if I can get 3 to 4 yards every single play, then I'll get more first downs. And then if I get more first downs, I'll get more touchdowns and field goals, and then I ultimately will win more games. So part of this, when we think about discipleship and disciple making, whatever our aim is, then we begin to reverse engineer is what are your 3 yards of play so that you can get more first downs, so that you get more first down so you get more touchdowns and field goals to win the game. What are the easy, obvious, and strategic steps in order to get there? If I was discipling someone and I would say, hey, half of my people or 90% of my people, based upon statistics, I never plan to share their faith, right? If that's true, 90% of evangelicals never intend to share their faith. Here's the thing. I'm not just going to go out and try to score a touchdown. All right, y'all, so I'm going to get up on a sermon. I heard that stat, and the next sermon is like, so next Sunday, we're going to go out, we're going to do door-to-door evangelism, cold call. Right? That would probably be too much. You'll probably be by yourself with your lead team, and the only reason why your team will be there because they don't want to be fired, right? And so, but part of that is, you're trying to do that. So, but instead, why don't we think, what are the easy, obvious, and strategic steps in order to get there? So instead of saying, hey, next day we're going to do door-to-door evangelism, why don't we say something like this? Hey, over the next year, our goal is that we want every covenant member to be able to bring at least one soul to Jesus. Here's what that's going to look like. Starting this week, all I want you to do is identify 5 non-believing friends. Everybody has 5 non-believing neighbors. Everybody has that. Just write down 5 neighbors, and next week we'll talk about it. And then you know what? The next week you come and says, hey, all I want you to do is to take those 5 non-believing friends, and I just want you to pray this week for those 5 non-believing friends. The next week we come, hey, out of those 5, choose 2 of them and just call them and say, I've been praying for you. Is there anything specifically I can be praying for you about? The next week come back and says, hey, pray for the other 3 that you didn't pray for. And I'll call them and say, I've been praying for you. Week 5, come back and say, hey, what would it look like for you to call them and to say, hey, I've been praying for you. I just want to see if God has been answering any of those prayers. And then to say, why don't you invite them to lunch? And then when you invite them to lunch in a couple of weeks, week 7 or week 8, you invite them to lunch, just go and to ask 3 things. Hear their story, share your story, and share your testimony. Come back later, and then share you understand what I'm doing. right? And so part of this is like, I'm not just like, if the goal is, the ultimate aim is for every covenant member to be able to bring one soul to Jesus, then what I want to do is, what are the easy, obvious, and strategic steps? What's my 3 yards? What's my first downs? What's my touchdowns? So that I get more touchdowns and field goals so that I ultimately get the win. Right? And so part of this is that as leaders, we got to begin to think in these strategic ways. So we say it's clarity, movement, alignment. So just think about it. If we're on the goal, we got 11 people. We're back in the football analogy. Right? We're having 11 people in the line, and the receiver is out there. And he's just like, man, I know this player is about to work. I know a player is about to work. But they didn't call that play in the huddle. Does he run the play that he knows is going to work? If he knows 100% it's going to work, but the other 10 are not running that play, does he run that play? No. Why? Because there's no alignment. There's no alignment. And so what happens is that what I'm saying is that zeal is not enough. If 11 people lined up on the field and they says, I really want, even if they say 3 yards, I really want to get 3 yards. I really want to get a first down. I really want to, but there's no play called and everybody runs their own play, they're probably not going to get any forward progress. They're actually going to probably get a penalty because some people are going to be doing run plays and some people pass plays. And that's what ends up happening in our church. We think if we just say, hey, let's make disciples, but there's no play. There's no organization. There's no structure. Right? And so everybody is zealous. It's like, I really want to make disciples. I really want to make disciples. Even if we get them to that point, we end up fighting one another and cannibalizing different things because there's no playbook. Yeah. We're not on the same page. So the question becomes is alignment. So at our church, basically I ask every one of our ministries, how does your ministry help us to make disciples? How does your ministry help us to make disciples? Because if your ministry doesn't help us to make disciples, we probably don't need that ministry. Right? And so the question, so now we got to start asking the question is, how does the gift of administration help us to make disciples? How does the gift of hospitality help us to make disciples? How does the gift of helps? And you just start going through the different gifts, the different ministries. It says, how does it make disciples? Because here's the thing. If we said the goal of football is winning, the way you win is scoring more touchdowns and field goals, but we know that there are certain positions that you will go your whole career and never ever score a touchdown and never ever score a field goal. Does that mean you've had an unsuccessful career? No. Why? Because we know that centers, guards, and tackles are not designed to score touchdowns. But we also know that if centers, guards, and tackles don't block, there's no touchdowns getting scored. And that's the reason why when you had old school like Barry Sanders or, Emmitt Smith or whoever break rush records, you know who the first people they took out and bought cars for and did all the things? Right? It was the linemen. It was the centers, the guards, and the tackles. Right? I'm just telling you biblical principles because in 1 Corinthians 12 just says it this way. The more known gifts need to honor the lesser known gifts. Right? And we bring honor. And so the question is that administration is not just the stuff that we don't want to do. But it's significant for us to make disciples. It's significant because administrators are going to make sure that no one gets overlooked. And so being able to bring a sense of dignity and belonging to every single role, every single ministry, right, as we are creating our intentional plan. And so how are you aligning your ministries with the goal of making disciples, which leads me to this last one, focus. Saying no to good things so that we can say yes to better things. What are the better things is simply whatever was called in the huddle. Just whatever is called in the huddle. Again, if I'm the receiver out here and I know that I can score points or I can accomplish the goal, but if the play wasn't called, I don't run that play. The better thing in this context is whatever was called in the huddle. And if I know that this play will work the next play, what do? I go back to the huddle and I say, hey, this play is wide open. Right? But it's a sense of going back to what Acts talks about, that when the early church, there was a sense of oneness, one accord. Everybody had everything in common, right? I think that that is what's killing the American church, because we are so built on our independence, on our rights, right? And so it's killing us because it's about us. It's about me. But in the scriptures, the we is always greater than the me. And so being able to understand and to put us into put us on the same page and create focus is important. So clarity, movement, alignment, focus. Let me stop there for a second. Questions, comments, thoughts. Real quick, this is the most apologetic that we're going to get. We're going to get nuts and bolts. Second, and I did start it a little late, so I still got the 45 minutes. All right, good. All right, just wanted to make sure. All right, good. Questions, thoughts. All right. So in this, I wrote a book called Among Wolves. That if there is, some of this, so a lot of these principles are in the book in the book. Is the next slide. Among Wolves, and in this. The book, basically, it's a walking through the book of Matthew. And in the book of Matthew, basically, we begin with understanding that Jesus developed a vision from burden. And I believe that from the vision from burden, basically, we see 8 significant movements, all the way from God has birthed something in you to unleashing healthy disciple makers. And what are some significant steps in order to make that happen? And so we just walked through 8 significant moves. I also have an online course on what we call, and I think I have, it's on the city syllabus, which is, if you go to myblvd.co, it's an online masterclass. And that's the organization I run, myblvd.co. It's a masterclass that you can go. So we're only going to hit a very, very small section of this, but I mean, if you wanted to more of a fuller course, it's a self-guided course that you can walk through that helps you to build disciple making, not as a ministry, but the ministry of the church. All right. I also gave you guys these packets. Also, I'm sorry, there's a workbook that's on the next slide that they also have that comes alongside that book that we have. And again, both the book or the thing you can get it on Amazon or you can email me if we desire. So one of the things that I think that is important that we have. So right here, we're not going to go over this, but developing a vision from burden. Ultimately, the question that we have is, do you know your vision? Can you communicate it, and can you turn it around? I believe that the way you stop wearing Saul's armor is by understanding 4 significant stories. One is God's story. And you start with God's story. Number 2 is my story. What is God's providence in your life? I told you, I minister right now in the Old 4th Ward in Atlanta, Georgia, which is the largest Section 8 housing in all of the Southeast, but it's also the fastest growing gentrifying community in the city as well. So these worlds are on top of each other. But I recognize that oftentimes I say, am I working or am I what is this? I love what I get to do. I love where I live. And part of it is because of my story. My story is, I told you, I was raised by a pro athlete. So my first 10 or so years, it was like, go get whatever you want. But just like a lot of pro athletes, as soon as my dad's career was over, we were on welfare. And we went from one extreme all the way to the other extreme that quickly, right? And so I grew up. My dad disappeared from 10 years old all the way to about 14 years old. And I had the typical inner city kid story, right? Where grandma and aunts and and all that. There was no men in the house, and they were raising up the next generation of boys. And so that was my story for it. My dad came back into the picture in high school. He reappeared, but that was my journey. But so every time I'm in the 4th Ward, where it's the largest Section 8 housing and the fastest growing gentrifying community, I was just like, I feel comfortable because I feel comfortable amongst the affluent, but I also feel comfortable in the hood, amongst the poor. And so it was just like, so I recognized that was my story. So I minister in Dr. King's neighborhood, the birthplace of Dr. King. This is the place that I'm in. And so when we found out at our church that this was a little different than most gentrifying situations, is that because there was a property group called Wingate Community who had a 20-year lease with the city of Atlanta. we said we all need to move to the city, to the old Fourth Ward neighborhood, so that we can show the answer to gentrification is not simply the removing the poor, but it's the gospel made visible. And so our goal is that we wanted 50% of our church to be able to walk to church, right? So a church that shifts from an ethnic missiology to a neighbor missiology, where we're simply asking our question is, how do I reach my neighbor? When my neighbor no longer looks like me, talk like me, and act like me. Because in our neighborhood, when you have these two worlds together, the gentrified community is like, I love our neighbor if we can just get rid of the Section 8 housing. But then the Section 8 housing is like, we're the last standing hood in Atlanta, because since 1996, they started decentralizing all the poor, giving vouchers and moving them out to the suburbs, move them out to the city. So now this is taking place in all of America. So there's now more people in poverty living in suburbs and rural than actually living in the city. So the term inner city is a dying term in the way that we think about it, in the way that we know it. Right? Because of gentrification, because of the new urban, because of what's taking place in cities like Austin, Atlanta, and other places across the country. And so the question becomes is how do we make disciples in these contexts? Andy Stanley has a quote, and basically he says, vision is born in the soul of a man that's consumed with the tension between what is and what could be. Right? And I think that this is the idea, is it's like, are we consumed with this tension between what is and what could be? And our heart is to be able to develop that. And so, real quick, when we think about this, when I just to kind of land this biblically, and then we'll get into nuts and bolts. Biblically, 2 Timothy chapter 2 was my theme verse. It was the verse that I used. It was the verse that really was, my life verse about like my calling. And in 2 Timothy 2:2, it says, Paul is talking to Timothy. He says, and the things you heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, the same, Timothy, don't get cute with it, the same. Commit to faithful men who are able to teach others also. You probably have taught that verse before. In there you see 4 generations of Christians. Paul teaching Timothy, Timothy teaching faithful men teaching others. And so we see this idea of discipleship and disciple making. But as I began to read that verse more and more, and it became to get a part of me, what I recognize is like, yes, this is a verse about discipleship, but yes, it's a verse that has mentorship in it, but it's not just mentorship. Because we have reduced discipleship to just mentorship. 1-on-1, 1-on-3, 1-on-12, because we've taken, and for good reasons, yes, Jesus had the 3, Jesus had the 12, and Jesus also had 70. Did anybody believe that 1-on-70 in our current models would be considered discipleship? But he had 70, and then he even had more. He says many disciples left. Right? And so when we recognize this idea, so that was one issue that I had, because, again, when you're not raised in the church, you can just question everything, right? Because he doesn't have the traditions and all of those things. And so I was just like, I don't understand. The other thing that I recognize is that Jesus is the only person to ever walk the earth that had all the gifts of the Spirit. He is the only one. Colossians 1 says it this way. He says the fullness of God dwelt in Christ, the pleroma of God. Dwelt in Christ. So in Christ, he is both God's ideal man and he's man's ideal God. Right? And so we see a picture of who God is, but we also see kind of what we are called to do. But here's the thing. Everything he has done is not simply I must do. Everything he has done, we must do. And so my definition of disciple making is this. Disciple making is, do I have it on here? It's our capacity. I don't know if it's on there or not. I don't know what you have to say. Yeah. Disciple making is our capacity to lovingly imbibe the person and work of Jesus and to transfer him into the life of others. I think it's later, but I wanted to state it now. The reason why I developed that, because there's an old phrase, an old African proverb that says it takes a village. And ultimately, I believe that if it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a church to raise a Christian. And this is the reason why when I began to make a shift, that the idea of disciple making is primarily the role of the local church, right? Then I recognize this idea that this village mentality, because Jesus is the only person who ever walked the earth that had all the gifts of the Spirit. But if I want to see all the gifts of the Spirit, where do I have to go? The church. The church, right? Ephesians 3:10 basically tells us that. He says the multifaceted wisdom of God is in the church. And this is where I see the variety of different gifts of the gifts of the body. And so it's important for us to understand that it's our capacity to lovingly embody. And it was that I began to start searching because of this, because yes, Paul is talking to Timothy. Timothy is teaching the faithful men, and faithful men are teaching others. But not only is that taking place, this is in the context of a pastoral epistle. Paul is talking to young Timothy about his church and how do you develop and defend a disciple-making culture in your church, right? And I think that is important for us to recognize. All right. And so in here, basically, we see Paul. He starts off, says, "You therefore, my son, be strong in the grace of God." And he tells us that if we're going to make disciples, one, you got to be first strong in the grace, right? Strong in grace. And then one of the things that we see is that in a healthy Christian life, there's a couple of realities. One, we see that God, next slide, God is more holy than when we first start. I'm talking about a healthy Christian life. The other thing that we recognize is that we're more sinful. When I first came to know the Lord, I thought I was like, all right, just stop drinking, stop smoking, stop doing like all those things, and then I'll be good. But then when I stopped doing those things, right, I started realizing a couple of things, right? I start realizing the reasons, like, why I'm doing them is for the wrong motives. Tim Keller, I would say Timmy Keller, me and him boys. The late Tim Keller basically stated, he says, not only as believers do we need to repent from the bad things that we do, but we need to repent for the reason why we do the good things. And it was in that I really believe that what we see is that God is more holy, we're more faithful, but the problem is that our view of the cross remains the same. And what we end up doing is that the way we bridge that gap is we start placing our isms in to fill in. It's no longer grace is not enough. And we start filling our isms. You know what our isms is? It's our intellectualism. It's our legalism. It's our mysticism. It's our emotionalism. It's our aestheticism, right? And that becomes the thing that makes us feel more connected with God instead of his grace. But Colossians 2 basically tells us in the same way we receive Christ, therefore, walk in him. How do we receive him? By grace through faith. And so Paul is basically saying, if we're going to be about disciple making, you got to be strong grace. The second thing that he says is that you need to be single-minded like a soldier. Single-minded like a soldier. Paul says, do not entangle yourselves in the affairs of this world so that you may please the one who has enlisted him as a soldier. Right? And so part of this is like, how do we stay focused on discipleship? Because there's a lot of things you can do in the church, but what is the thing that God has called us to do? How are we staying focused on it? Because sometimes, as parents and as fathers and as all that, it's just like, that's one thing that we struggle because there's not an immediately feedback loop. It's like, are my kids doing well? I don't know. We'll see in about 10 years. Right? I mean, you just don't know. And then we've all been a part of investing in somebody for years for them just to turn around, punt the faith. And they're just like, man, that was a lot of investment. That was a lot of time. And so it's easy to say, man, I'd just rather start counting attendance. I'd rather just start counting size of my building. And what we end up doing is start measuring other things instead of measuring faithfulness. Instead of measuring. But so Paul says, be single-minded. He also tells us to be disciplined like an athlete. When I was thinking about this one, I was thinking about actually, you guys know who that is? FloJo. FloJo was known as the fastest woman in the world. She had a 10.98. And I remember when she ran her 100 meters, Good Morning America asked her, she's like, hey, I heard you ran the 100 meter. And basically FloJo, but some people said, there was a wind behind her, so people was questioning whether or not they needed to take that away and questioning her and all that. And he's like, but your pundits would say this, and it says, and they would even say it was because of your beauty, that's why they gave it to you and all that. And so they're having this conversation, and she's like, what would you say to your pundits? And FloJo says, well, I would invite them into my workout. And she went on to say, how I work out multiple days every week for 5 hours a day and go. And then she was just talking about all of her regimen, only eating certain types of foods, only doing certain things. And I was like, here is Flojo, who eats only certain things, work out so many times a day for this many hours a day for 4 consecutive years for a 12-second race. And I was just like, how much more as believers are we to discipline ourselves for an eternal prize? Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And he's just like, what are we doing and how can we do that? So Paul says, be disciplined like an athlete. And finally, he tells us to be persevering like a farmer. I don't know about you, but urban church planners, if you've been a good urban church planner, at some point you had to plant a garden, community garden and all that. It's just to be like, I didn't know what I was doing, but I was like, everybody else is doing it, I guess I got to do it too, right? And so I got to grow my own food and organic and all of those things. I'm a good urban church planner, right? And so I went, and so I go out and I go to Home Depot, and I was like, hey, I'm trying to do this garden. I got about a yay-so pot of land, and I was like, will you give me the stuff that I need? And it was like, there's this thing called a tiller, right? Like, I'm an urban dude. I don't know nothing about it. Is it a tiller? I don't know. See, that's what I'm talking about. So I got that contraption, and they asked me, how long do you need it for? I was like, an hour or two. I'll bring it right back, So I get it, and I'm up here, and I'm mowing, I'm doing the thing, and getting the dough, and I was just like, and I called it back, all right, this is going to take a little longer than I thought it was going to take, And so basically a couple of days later, as I got to the place to get my little place, I was like, man, that was a lot of work for a bunch of grounded up dirt. So, but look, I went and I was like, all right, this time I go back. I went and I bought a book that says, oh, how do you do this? And so I was reading the book, and I placed the seed, and I watered it every day. And then I got up, and after a week or so, what I ended up having? Weeds. I was like, that's not what I wanted, right? And I just kept doing it, but all I can do was stay faithful to the book. Stay faithful to the book and do what the book is calling me to do and trust that the book knows what it's talking about. And it's in the same way as believers, right? As we are making disciples, and it may not get us on Christianity today. It may not get us on the fastest growing church. It may not get us on all the things, but all we can do and our call is to stay faithful to the book. That's right. Stay faithful to the play that's been called by the play caller. And ultimately, he says, you got to persevere like a farmer. And Timothy, think about what's going on. Paul in 2 Timothy is a different apostle, a different person than he was in Galatians. You remember Galatians, Philippians, Paul was like, yeah, to live is Christ, to die is great. To be with God. Like, he was just like, I'm about it, right? Like, Paul is like, 2 Timothy, Paul, I've been poured out like a drink offer. I'm tired. I've been running this race. I'm ready to go be with my Lord. Like, he's a different Paul. Just think about that. 2 Timothy, Paul starts naming names. Paul mentions 23 names, more than any other of his books. He's just like, man, that person deserted me. That person left me. That person refreshed me. Bring him. Hey, remember John Mark? I know we had some scuffles and all that, but bring him back because he refreshed me. Right? Like, so Paul is naming names. He's at the end of his life. He says, man, because why? Ministry is hard. Yeah. People are going to leave you, Timothy. Things are going to get tough, Timothy. But what is Paul's message to Timothy? Stir up the gift, Timothy. Endure for the sake of the elect. Keep fighting. It's worthy. Be ready in season and out of season. Don't go to the tickling ear thing, because that's gonna make you feel better, Timothy. But you stay faithful. You see, Paul's message to Timothy, Paul's message to us is that I know it's hard, and I know even some of the pastors and some of the leaders that were running with us early have left. Endure. Keep going. And not just endure for the sake of enduring, but keep making disciples. Because that's the heart, that's the goal of what we are trying to do. So I want to end there. We can take a break, and then we're going to come back, and I promise it's all nuts and bolts. We're going to talk about this specifically. How do we do this at Blueprint Church? And so how do we want to transition?
Yeah. All right. Give him a hand for this. Great.
All right, so, all right, let's go nuts and bolts. Nuts and bolts. First, let me just say, like in here, this first page is really, I just put this on here for you to understand and know we're not going to be kind of going through this, but if you want to know, go from how do you develop that thing that you must do. Prof. Hendricks, when I went to Dallas Theological Seminary, basically used to say there's a lot of things that you can do, but what's the thing that you must do? Right? And that's really what we're talking about, is that thing that you must do, because the reason why I say developing a vision from burden, not just developing a vision, because it's important. When you have a vision from burden, is another word that we can relate, is a word called passion, right? And passion, the way I define passion is a willingness to endure the pain for something that's greater than the pain, right? No matter what you do, it's going to cause pain. And what is the thing that's not just good ideas, but it is the thing that God, you know that God has called you to. So developing a vision from burden, and I believe in the book, like I said, this is where you can get like a more of a format of how you develop that vision from burden. But then when we talk about communicating, I just really want to fight, because if your job is to create clarity, to create a playbook, one of the first things that you have to do is a formula that I use to help us create that forces me to get to a place of clarity, right? So what I would say is that we want to blank by blank so that blank. All right, so in here, there's the who, there's the what, there's the when, and here's the why. All right. So one of the things when we talk about developing a vision from burden, you know, what I teach the staff, because again, what it is, we are trying to, not just you guys are all amazing vision casters, right? What I'm trying to help is everybody to be able to carry that same vision, right? And I'm fighting for simplicity, not comprehension. Follow me and you will become fishers of men. Right? And so in here, what we talk about, your church wants to blank by blank so that blank, the who, the what, the when, and the why. And so like, for instance, one of the things that we will talk about, we're talking clarity. I'll get to the staff and I'll talk to the staff and I says, our vision, we want to care, equip, and mobilize every covenant member by whatever date, by 2026, so that we can unleash healthy people to do ministry where life exists, right? And so this is our overarching statement. So when we say we want to disciple every covenant member, what I want to do, I'm pressing tab on that. And when I'm providing clarity, what we are saying is that we want to care, equip, and mobilize every covenant member so that we can unleash them, right, to do ministry where life exists. That is important because right now what I'm doing is I'm getting this all on the same page. I'm not trying to be comprehensive, but when we'll talk about it, but what I'm trying to do is make sure that it is clear. It is clear because what we're trying to do is we're developing culture. We can go back a couple of slides. We're developing culture. And when developing culture, right, there's 4 ways that you develop culture. Number 1 is you have to teach on it. You have to teach, you have to communicate, and you have to communicate with clarity. Number 2, you have to model it. You have to model it. You have to show examples, models and examples of what you are doing. Number 3, you got to prioritize it or bring structure to it. You can't say church is not about Sunday, but everything you do is about Sunday. And I see this all the time with church planners, right? And people just like, I got to get, my first hire is my worship leader, my children's director, whatever, for Sunday. Everything I'm doing is for Sunday. And then I get up on my first message and say, hey, y'all, it's not about Sunday. Right? Then this is what we do over and over again. And we start wondering why we're not getting different results, right? Because there's this thing called insanity. It's doing the same things, but expecting different results. Just because we're teaching something different does not mean we're doing something different, right? And so how are we modeling? How are we prioritize? I remember when I first came to the church and they were just like, and people was like, we need to be out sharing our faith. We need to be out there with our neighbors. We need to be out. And I was just like, but you tell us to come here every single night. It's like, I can't be at church and with my neighbors. Like there's a tension that I was having. And again, I wasn't raised in the church. So I was just like, I don't understand that you can't have both. And it's sort of like me saying, I'm happy. People are always going to believe your nonverbals more than your verbals. They're always going to believe your nonverbals. And if your structure is not saying the same thing, then you do it. So at our church, when we say care, equip, and mobilize every covenant member, basically we have our church divided in that way. We have a care department, an equipping department, mobilize department. In all of our ministries, we fall under there. So we are structuring that. And so when we come, we want to care, equip, and mobilize every covenant member, right? In there, there's pass or fail, right? There's not ambiguous. I'm not saying we just want to love God and love our neighbors, because it's like, how do we know if we made it? Right? But in there he says caring, equipping, and mobilizing every covenant member. So that means there's a definite number. It's sort of like saying, hey guys, I'm married, I have 6 children, and if I says I care, equip, and mobilize, I parent 3 out of my 6 kids. Would anybody be like, man, you're a good dad. Oh, that's awesome. What if I said 4 out of the 6? Would you be good? You was like, that's 80%. 5 out of the 6? No, the only acceptable answer is 100%. So why are we okay then? Because we said the church is not like family, but it is family. Why are we okay with saying, 50% of our people are in small groups? 30% of our people are being discipled. No. So the system I'm talking about that we're developing is that we are caring, equipping, and mobilizing every covenant member. That's why when we say a call to membership is a call to discipleship. If you are saying that you want to be a member of this church, you are saying that you want to be discipled by this church. So if you want to hide, this is the wrong place. Because we're going to talk about you. We're going to be praying for you. We're going to be thinking about you, because our commitment to you is that we're going to care for you. We're going to equip you. We're going to mobilize every single one of you in our church. That's a commitment. And we're not going to just measure it by just doing events. That's not the measurement. There's a personal thing. And so and we'll talk about what that looks like in there. But so you have to teach, you have to model, you have to structure or prioritize. Your structure has to be around that. And then last, you have to celebrate. You have to celebrate. You want to celebrate what you want to see more of. You want to celebrate what you want to see more of. And if I'm caring, equipping, and mobilizing every covenant member, then that is what we want to see. We want to make sure that we see more of it. And so part of this is that I create a statement, and we always, the old John Wooden says, this is a basketball. Ultimately, I come back every 90 days, every as much as I can say in staff, I remind, I says, listen, our job is to care, equip, and mobilize every covenant member. That's the thing that was like, there's many things that we change and shift a little bit, but that statement is our staff statement that we hold on to. That is our responsibility. And so what I'm trying to do is create clarity, right? Because now when you say, okay, what does it mean to care for, right? Well, what it means to care for is like we have 3 levels of care. Every covenant member is assigned a city group. Every covenant member is assigned a staff member, and every covenant member is assigned members assigned to every covenant member. And then every covenant member is an elder is assigned to every covenant member. So we talk about 3 levels of care. So when I say care, our staff knows what we're talking about. There's 3 levels of care, right? And so in the same thing, equip and mobilize. And so what we do is we're trying to understand what we're doing. And so when we talk about mobilize, right, the harvest is plentiful, the laborers are few. I think we prayed it earlier. It's like at some point we have to shift what success is. Success is not about our seating capacity, but success is about our sending capacity. And so this is how we've always measured success. And so our heart we want to be an answer to the prayer of Matthew chapter 9, 35 through 38. When Jesus says the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. So he tells them to pray to the Lord of the harvest. So how are we praying to the Lord of the harvest? And so we want to develop culture in that way. And so when we talk about creating clarity, movement, alignment, and focus, right? Now we can go to that slide. Clarity, movement, alignment, focus. Next slide. Clarity, basically we're saying, what is our DNA? What are our aims? Right? What is an aim? It's the DNA. It's the thing that we want to reproduce. Right? I love the sign. Healthy leaders reproduce in healthy disciples, reproduce in healthy churches. So the question is that we are reproducing something. And so the question is, what are we trying to reproduce? What are you aiming to reproduce? Right? And so Jesus, we're going back to the example that we have, follow me and you will become fishers of men. We say, follow us, and this is our DNA, our DNA statement basically comes as like, this is what we say every single year. We come back to these aims. This is our foundation, right? And my goal is not to be cute. Paul says in the same thing that, the things you heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, the same, Timothy, commit to faithful men. And so my job is not to be comprehensive. I want to be memorable. I want to be clear, concise, and compelling. I want you guys to be able to remember what we're doing. And so what we say is our DNA. And and again, I'll do all different types of things. Sometimes I got up and says, hey, I got $10 for anybody in the congregation who knows our DNA. Right? And I'll do anything just because I want you to know what it is. Because the heart is that I put any of our covenant members in a room by themselves that they would know our DNA. They know where we're going. And so in here, what we say is that our DNA is basically our philosophy. The gospel changes people, and God uses people to change the world. So, therefore, our mission, we exist as a church to unleash healthy people to do ministry where life exists, where they live, where they work, and where they worship. Right? That's our heart. To unleash healthy people to do ministry where life exists. So how do we define health? Healthy is someone who is growing in the gospel, in the context of family, while on mission. Gospel, family, mission. So everything that we do is aimed, here's our aims, at these four things. To be gospel-centered believers, responsible siblings, indigenous disciple makers, and generous stewards. Right? And so in there, ultimately what we're doing is we're talking about our relationship with God, our relationship with other believers, relationship with our neighbors, and our relationship with our time, talent, and treasure. Christianity is not a religion, but it's about relationships. Your relationship with God, your other believers, your neighbors, and so in each one, we ultimately are walking through. And there's a drop-down menu that we create for each one. Gospel-centered believers, we want them to be fluent in the gospel and understand their identity in Christ. Responsible siblings, we want everybody in our church to be able to answer these two questions. Who in this church are you responsible for, and who in this church is responsible for you? Because if no one in this church is responsible for you, and what do I mean by responsible? What I mean is, if you were in a pinch, people's priorities would change immediately to come and fix it. Because if somebody came up to me right now and said, hey, Dahadi, something's going on, with the family, you need to go talk, go. And I would immediately say, hey, Ann, or somebody, can you guys come up and take, because my priorities switch, because who's responsible for my kids? Me. I'm responsible. So who in this church would their priorities change if they knew you were in? Because your identity drives your activity. I don't have to get you worrying about doing a bunch of activities. I want you to find your identity in the responsibility of who is my brother, who is my neighbor. We have been running from who our brother is, our sister, our neighbor, ever since Cain, since sin entered into the world. Where we don't want to take responsibility for anyone. And so we're asking, who is our neighbor? Who is our brother? Who is our sister? Right? And so who in this church, because if you don't understand who your brother, who's responsible, what you're going to end up doing 3 months from now, you're going to come and talk to me about how you're not connected to the church and why you're leaving. And so part of this is like, we want you to be responsible. So who are you responsible and who's responsible for you? And digital discipling, how are you intentionally using your time, talent, and treasure in order to make disciples where you live, work, and worship? Right? And then generous steward is basically how are you using all of your time, your talent, and treasure to cultivate the other three relationships? Because stewardship is not a subcategory of the Christian life. It is the Christian life. How you use your time, your talent, and treasure to cultivate your relationship with God, your relationship with your neighbor, and your relationship with other believers is the Christian life. Your time, your talent, and your treasure. And so ultimately we're trying to cultivate that. And so we are saying we're really clear. This is our aims. Everything that we do is based upon that. So this is a part of that clarity. Right? We want our congregation to know clarity. I want my staff to know clarity. I want all of us to understand that we have clarity. And so that's why you teach it, you model it, you structure around it, and you celebrate it. All right. And so that's the first thing that we do. And then we just begin to apply that on multiple levels. Right? Again, this is not like, I'm always thinking about like sandlot football. Right, this is like going, when you sandlot football, if you ever play, you just go and you do 5 yards out, and you're just drawing on the dirt. I want to create stuff where anybody in our church can take it and reproduce it. I don't want them to have to feel like you got to go to seminary and do all these other things. Like, I want to be able to say, hey, you can reproduce this, right? If you want to be a disciple maker, all you have to do is invite people in the relationship, challenging them to change to look more like Jesus, transformation to look like Jesus, right? And so that is the goal. And so when we say looking more like Jesus, what does that mean? That they're gospel-centered believers, responsible siblings, indigenous disciple makers, and generous stewards, right? And so ultimately, we're really clear. And so then I begin to ask the question, again, a healthy person, gospel, family, mission. The next slide, basically, I start asking those questions of Dahadi. Am I growing in the gospel in the context of family while on mission? Right? Am I the type of person that I would want to see reproduced? Right? And what disciplines am I doing to cultivate that? And then I ask the second question. My marriage. Is my marriage growing in the gospel in the context of family while on mission? What disciplines am I doing to cultivate that? Do I have the type of marriage that I would want to see reproduce? Then I go to the Lewis 8. Are we growing in the gospel in the context of family while on mission? Do I have the type of nuclear family I would want to see reproduce? What disciplines am I doing to cultivate that? And then I go to we call city groups, which is missional communities oftentimes, right? And I ask, are we growing in the gospel? You guys get it? And then I talk about the church. Are we growing in the gospel in the context of family while on mission? And I say, what disciplines are we doing? Do I have the type of church I would want to see reproduce? Because we can talk about making disciples and reproducing on the individual leadership level, all of that, but some of us don't need to reproduce because we're a hot mess. So the question is, what are we reproducing? Right? Because here's the thing, you teach what you know, but you reproduce who you really are. You reproduce who you really are. And so at the core, what are you reproducing? What are you reproducing? And so when I'm thinking about it, I'm literally taking something like this, a circle like this, and I'm writing off to the sides of like, what disciplines am I doing to cultivate that in my personal life, in my marriage, in my family, in my home? And I'm writing down disciplines. But here's the thing, disciplines are not a sign of strength. Disciplines is actually an admission of weakness. I'm weak. So we work out 5 times a week, not because I'm strong. I work out 5 days a week because I'm actually weak. I played football my whole life, and literally after football was over, I was on a rebellion. I'm never working out again. Until I started creeping up in them LBs. And I was like, all right, something's gonna have to happen. Right? You know, because we was on that seafood diet. Y'all know that seafood diet, you see food and you eat it, right? That's all I was. And so that was it. And I was just like, I can't keep doing that. So I needed to start working out to remind me. I'm weak. I'm selfish. I like me. I want to feed me, right? All the times. My favorite subject is me. And after I'm done talking about me, I want to know what you think about me. Right? And so what I do, and I tell people all the time, the reason why we give our first fruits to God in our time, our talent, in our church is not to say we're strong, we're a super Christian. We do that to remind us that if I don't give my first 10 or my first fruits to the Lord, I will end up spending all of my money on me because that's my favorite subject. And I need to remind myself that with my first fruits, that this is not about me, but something bigger than me. So I give the first fruit, I give the first 10 to remind myself that 100% of